We all know that a living and current language is subject to constant evolution. But are all these changes well regarded and accepted by the community? Among the latest trends in the ways of communication in the Spanish language, there is none that generates more controversy and debate than the proposal to use inclusive language in both written and spoken forms. And we'll tell you why. First of all, we need to understand what the expression inclusive language means and the reasons behind its proposal by certain activist groups that have language academies around the world, academic institutions, and major figures in linguistics and literature on edge. Surprisingly, and contrary to what many believe, the term inclusive language is nothing new. Its origin dates back to the second wave of feminism, which took place from the early 1960s to the late 1980s, a period when the lack of relevance of the feminine gender in language or even its derogatory representation began to be questioned. In this way, inclusive language was born as a synonym for the inclusion of the feminine gender in everyday language. But in recent years, this term has also been used to include sexual minorities, or the so-called lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community. In addition, it has also started to be used by young people and activists against gender and identity discrimination. The United Nations defines in its guidelines for coexistence that inclusive language is the way of expressing oneself both orally and in writing, without discriminating against any particular sex, social gender, or gender identity, and without perpetuating gender stereotypes. And it maintains that using this type of language is an extremely important way to promote gender equality in all types of communicative situations, whether oral or written, formal or informal, with both internal and external audiences. For the Royal Spanish Academy, inclusive language is the one that applies the recommendations proposed by certain sectors of feminism to make women visible in discourse, assuming that the generic use of the masculine excludes them. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell to get notified about new videos. So after all this, what exactly is inclusive language? Inclusive language refers to any verbal or written expression that preferably uses neutral vocabulary, or it makes both masculine and feminine forms evident, avoiding the use of the masculine as a generalization for situations or activities where men, women, or other gender identities are present. At first, inclusive language had greater representation in written form, with symbols like the @ sign, mainly used as a way to abbreviate, and not having to use nouns in both masculine and feminine forms. For example, instead of writing girls and boys, that noun was written without explicit gender, replacing the grammatical gender distinction with the @ sign. However, in recent years, the explicit mention of both genders has been promoted in a well-known phenomenon. For example, it's about not just saying the boys to refer to both boys and girls, but mentioning both genders. In this way, according to inclusive language, one should say the gentlemen and the ladies, the teachers and the female teachers, the Spanish men and the Spanish women, etc. One of the aspects that has touched a nerve the most is the recommendation to use inclusive non-binary language, meaning language that doesn't exclusively categorize as male or female, using the letter X or I to avoid using the grammatical gender established by the vowels, or O in the case of masculine and A in the case of feminine. So the suggestion is to write amigues with an X instead of amigos or amigas, niñe instead of niño or niña, lis instead of los or las, etc. The Fox Premium Network made an unprecedented milestone in 2018 by premiering the series Pose, produced by Ryan Murphy, where it included the letter E in its Spanish and Portuguese subtitles to establish inclusive language, making its message of inclusion and diversity clear to the world. Another way to introduce inclusive language, according to its promoters, is the use of more inclusive generic vocabulary. For example, avoid saying the citizens and instead say the citizenry. Don't say the indigenous people, but rather indigenous population. Don't say teachers and students, but rather faculty and student body. Instead of saying the children, you should say childhood. Instead of saying the rights of man, you should say human rights, and so on. But what does the Royal Spanish Academy and other academies of letters and linguistics think about this whole social, political, and cultural movement? What do the major educational and academic institutions think? And most importantly, what do people and ordinary citizens in general think? As expected, the Royal Spanish Academy does not accept the use of inclusive language at all. Or, well, at least not for the most part, and you'll see why. The Royal Spanish Academy has publicly stated that so-called inclusive language means artificially altering the way gender works in Spanish, based on the subjective premise that the use of the generic masculine makes women invisible. And they conclude by arguing that the use of the AT symbol, or the letters E and X, as supposed markers of inclusive gender, is completely foreign to the morphology of Spanish. This to conclude that it goes against the natural use of a language that has evolved for centuries. In general, critics of inclusive language consider it a distortion of the language and argue that the language itself is not really an example of inequality, since language always interrelates and never excludes. Regarding double mention or splitting, the language academies consider it a mark of courtesy in cases like ladies and gentlemen or ladies and gentlemen. But except for those uses, even though they are grammatically correct, it turns out to be artificial and unnecessary, and can even become annoying. And it adds complexity to both written and spoken expression, since it does not contribute to simplicity in communication. They also understand that what bothers the inclusive language movement the most is the generalization of the masculine for any gender. At the same time, they point out that in the Spanish language, the masculine gender is the default unmarked, meaning it has a general sense and broad distribution, and at no time is it intended to exclude the feminine gender, and that this is a result of the activists' ignorance as they confuse it with the semantic gender of words, which would be the case of distinguishing between male and female sex, meaning that the feminists would be making a big deal out of nothing. However, the Royal Spanish Academy does not ignore the efforts toward inclusion in a globalized and progressive world, and this is reflected in the fact that certain forms have changed over the years. As in the case of professions, where explicit mention of the masculine gender is no longer made in order to include generalized nouns. So this is a reason for feminism to feel relieved. But this is far from being an admission of inclusive language as such. And you, what do you think about it? As I said at the beginning of the video, change and evolution of a language are inevitable. But is inclusive language the way to go? Do you think most people would agree with this? Do you think it would really simplify the language and make it easier to understand? Leave your comments down below and tell us your reasons, and that's all for today. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to this channel. I invite you to turn on the notification bell to get notified about new videos. See you soon.